people at Nunez. We have Catherine Lemoyne in the audience who does such a wonderful job of organizing all of this, and it's my pleasure and privilege to work with her. And of course, I'm Bill Hyland, your parish historian and the director of our Los Isleños Museum Complex in St. Bernard Village. So, many, many years ago, one of my cousins in New Orleans was Marie-Joséphine Cruzat de Vergès, otherwise known as Marie de Vergès. And Marie was born in 1890. She was the great-great-granddaughter of Chalmette, and she was also, as I said earlier, my cousin. And as I became more and more involved in St. Bernard, she said, "You know, Bill, I want you to promise me that you will do something to make the people in St. Bernard Parish know that there was a living, breathing human being, one of whose names was Chalmette, and that he's someone that they should be very proud of, and that I know that he would be very proud to have a community such as Chalmette named for him." So with that in mind, we'll begin now talking about Chalmette. So here, his name, Ignace François Martin de Lino. It was actually Martin de Lino, and they were from Piedmont. This was according, in what is today Italy, this was according to the research that Marie's father, Joseph William Cruzat, had done. He was, for decades, the treasurer of the Louisiana Historical Society, and one of his cousins was Charles Gaillard, one of the great early historians of Louisiana. Of course, he's my cousin as well. But anyway, Chalmette is named for his maternal grandfather, who was Ignace François Brutin. Brutin was an engineer. He came to Louisiana before there was a New Orleans. He was an early accomplished cartographer, and most importantly, perhaps, while he had been the commandant of Natchez, and while he had warned Governor Perrier to be careful to honor the commitments that the French had made to the Natchez nation, which they did not do, which resulted in the Natchez Massacre in 1729, which happily he escaped, or he was not there, because Perrier didn't want Brutin there, because Brutin had the temerity to disagree with him. So as a result, he was spared having to go through the massacre, and undoubtedly would have been killed. But in any event, after that, though, Brutin designed and was responsible in large measure with a building contractor whose name was Claude-Joseph Villard-Dubreuil for designing and building the face of French colonial New Orleans. So I think it's very interesting to note that. His wife was Marie-Madeleine Lemaire, and she had married at Saint-Sulpice in Paris, France, François de Marigny de Montville, actually François de Montville, who was born in Montreal in 1682. And when he died in New Orleans in 1728, he was the Major de Place, or the commander of troops, in the fledgling town of New Orleans, and he's buried in St. Louis Cathedral. And of course, one of his great-grandsons was Bernard de Marigny. But in any event, Brutin, I can't begin to tell you what an important person he was, very scrupulous in the way that he handled his business. He, of course, became stepfather to Antoine-Philippe de Marigny de Monteville and his younger brother, Jean-Jacques, who died. And then he had a son who was Ignace François Brutin, and then he had two daughters, and the two daughters were each married twice. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But through those marriages of those daughters, the Pontalbert, Denis Laronde, and Chalmette families all became closely related. You see, Louisiana has always been incestuous. This is an image of the Couvent des Ursulines, the Ursuline convent, which is today on Charter Street. It was designed by Brutin in 1745, and the construction began in the late 1740s. It was completed in 1752, and it is today the oldest documented standing structure in the Mississippi Valley. And note what I say, documented, because we can actually find the plans, and I've seen the plans for the Ursuline convent in the National Archives of France. Let's see now if we can get this, wait a minute. So here we have 1720, the baptism of Louis Xavier Delino de Chalmette. And for those of you who are familiar with Chalmette, I want to call your attention to the Chalmette. His son, who was Ignace François Martin Delino de Chalmette, spelled his name Chalmette, and the only thing that I can see is that since he became an officer in the Spanish military, which we will talk about later, Chalmette to them would have been Chalmette, pronouncing it in Spanish, so probably just so he wouldn't have the experience of having his name mispronounced, he dropped the final T-E. That's the only thing that I can see, because his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, they all used the E-T-T-E at the end. So, and you see he was actually born in Quebec City. The Chalmette family had been counselors of the king. They had held very high office in Quebec. Branches of the family went at some point to Saint-Domingue. It's really a fascinating history. Chalmette actually became appended to the Delino name because the Lord Delino, according again to the research that William Cruzat did, he married the sole surviving child of the Seigneur de Chalmette. And so he insisted then that Delino append to his name Chalmette. So then it became even more onerous. Martin Delino de Chalmette. And Chalmette actually is the name of a pasture which one can see in the northern part of Provence in the eastern part of France. So it was probably fallow land 400 years ago, and today it's essentially fallow as well, but very beautiful. So, and here we see Louis Xavier Delino de Chalmette. You see he signs it, Delino. See if I can get this damn thing to work. See, Delino de Chalmette, and you see how he signs it. That's Chalmette's father. That's a baptism from 1754 in the records, the sacramental records of St. Louis Cathedral, of another family member. So it's interesting. Delino de Chalmette and Denis de la Ronde came to Louisiana with Pierre Rigaud de Vaudreuil, who was from Quebec. He was actually one of the Quebecois, one of the Quebec people who carried a title of nobility. That was very rare in Quebec. There were people who were noble, but very few people who had titles of nobility. Another family that had a title of nobility was Le Moyne de Bienville and Le Moyne d'Iberville. The Le Moynes actually had, their father was Charles Le Moyne, or Le Moyne, and then he was made the Baron de Longueuil. And I can remember that there were people in my family, Marie de Vergis was one of them, who would tell me in French that they remembered hearing people say in the family, beware of the Longueuil, because they were considered expert politicians and very crafty. So in any event, but anyway, so Denis de la Ronde and Chalmette both came here as aides de camp to Rigaud de Vaudreuil. But then what's very interesting, they were also first cousins, because their mothers were both Chartier de la Binière. And that Chartier family, again, goes back to the very founding of Nouvelle-France, of Quebec. So you see, it's really something. So here we have these two men coming here, Pierre Denis Laurent, the father, whose father and grandfather had all been earlier in Louisiana at the beginning of the 18th century. And then Chalmette coming here, as I said, again, first cousins. So all this genealogy can be somewhat boring, but it is interesting. So here we have in 17, let's see, I think it's 55. I know he was born in 55. I can't remember when the baptism was. This is actually a copy, a certified copy, which was made from the baptismal registry that William Cruzat's father had gathered from the St. Louis Cathedral. And so you see that it talks about where they came from. His godfather was Ignace Brutin, who was the son of the engineer and architect who was in the French Navy. And you could see the different people signing, including his grandmother, whose portrait you'll see a little bit later. And then here we have, in 1773, a power of attorney. And here you see, for the very first time, the young man signing his name, Derlino, Ignace Derlino, right there. He never really learned to speak Spanish very well, and because of the Spanish policy of causing Louisianians to become reconciled to the presence of Spain and the administration of Spain, it really was not essential. What was essential was to have Louisianians who would fight against the expansion of the British Empire in North America. And that Ignace Francois Martin Delino Chalmette most definitely did do. But in any event, in this power of attorney, he is renouncing his father's share in the succession of Ignace Francois Brutin. Let me see now, we get this down here. And let's see. This is very interesting. This is a later letter. This is in 1785, and it is by Delino to his brother-in-law, who was Francois Anule d'Olivaudet. And the reason for this is, by this time, Chalmette has married Victoire Vaugine. Her father was Etienne Vaugine de Nuismont, and he was a very early officer in Louisiana in the French period. He was commandant for decades of Natchitoches. And then, so Chalmette married Victoire Vaugine. François Livaudet married Pélagie Vaugine, two sisters. So in this particular letter, and you'll notice it's dated Pensacola because he was actually stationed there in 1785 as an officer in the Spanish militia. He did not fight, so far as I can tell, in the Battle of Baton Rouge or Montchac, but he did fight in the Battle of Mobile in 1780, and then he was stationed there at Pensacola for quite some time. And then from Pensacola, he went to Arkansas. But anyway, one of the Libertons was failing to pay a bill that he owed to Chalmette. So Chalmette is asking his brother-in-law, Livaudet, to collect the bill. But as was typical of Chalmette, he says, please be kind to Liberton. His wife has been ill, he's lost a child, so be as gentle and as kind as you can be in collecting the bill, though I do need my 2,000 piastres fort. But this is very typical of Chalmette. He was always very gregarious, very generous. He was really always a very kind paterfamilias. You know, he really presided over his family with great gentleness. And indeed, at points, sometimes his children got the best of him. After 1785, he actually went to the Arkansas Post, and he was there until the early 1790s. And Arkansas Post in those days was in the southern part of the state near the Mississippi. And it was an outpost wherein the Western European fur traders interacted with the indigenous Native American people. So it was very wild, and his children were coming of age there in this wilderness at the Arkansas Post. And so his wife, Victoire, insisted on going down the Arkansas River a little bit to the Mississippi and coming to New Orleans as often as she could, because in a letter to Pierre-Philippe de Marigny, she went on to say that she was very concerned about the girls and the boys because they were running barefoot in the red clay of Arkansas. And this just did not sit well with her. And she was determined to come back to New Orleans so that her children could have a better education. So finally, in 1792, Chalmette was tired of Arkansas. He had run afoul of different political problems there, as had Bernard Dautrive before him and those who came after him. But he'd made enough money, though, in the fur trade personally, that he was able to come to Louisiana. So at first, he bought a piece of property at what is today Toka Village in the Isleño settlement of St. Bernard. And it's actually the area of Toka that's called the Island. And he actually had a very small working sugar plantation there with a sugar mill. Then he was able finally in 1794 to begin purchasing what would become the Chalmette plantation. And he actually purchased the plantation that had belonged to his grandmother's first husband, Francois de Monville. The Marignys no longer wanted it, so they sold it to him. So he actually purchased an indigo plantation, and then he converted it into the cultivation of sugar. So let's see now if we can go a little bit farther on this. There you see his name, his signing, Dearly Known. And by the way, you can see he's very well educated in his handwriting. There's a real difference in the handwriting of an adolescent of 1770 versus an adult and an officer in the Spanish militia in 1785. And he always signed his name, by the way, Dearly Known. So here we see a map of the Arkansas Post site that I was talking about earlier. And today it's actually a National Park Service site, and it's managed by the National Park Service. And then here we have the death of Chalmette's mother, who was also the mother of Pierre Denis de la Ronde. So we have Louis Xavier Dearly Known de Chalmette and Pierre Denis de la Ronde, the father, who were first cousins. Then, when Louis Xavier Chalmette dies, then his widow marries his first cousin, Pierre Denis de la Ronde. So this means that Chalmette is Denis de la Ronde's half-brother. But the two men could not have been more apart. They were very, very different people, and we'll talk about that after a while. But anyway, she's buried in the St. Louis Cathedral along with her mother and many members of the family. And she was quite the lady, too. She was very well known, believe it or not, as an equestrian, and she also particularly liked to hunt wild game. That's an oral tradition that's come down in the family. But she loved to ride horseback, and as I say, she was a deadly shot. So a very interesting person. So this is the Royal Sonesta, and you would wonder, well, why in the world is Bill showing the Royal Sonesta? Well, I'll tell you why. The Royal Sonesta occupies the block from Bienville to Conti. I think it is. Yeah, from Bienville to Conti. And actually, Chalmette's townhouse, the house that he fled to from his plantation, was there, one house away from the corner of Conti and Bourbon Street. And actually, the house stood until the early 1960s. And I remember one time I had to attend a ball that the French consulate was having, and it was held at the Royal Sonesta. So Marie had called to speak to me about different things, and she asked what I was doing that evening. And when I told her I was going to the Royal Sonesta, I've never heard her so angry with me. She said, "How can you go to that place? You know they destroyed Chalmette's house for that terrible hotel." But in any event, though, the house actually was very, very commodious. It had been designed by Gurley and Guillot. It was a story and a half, and it was very well appointed. And actually, they were able to hold on to the townhouse, and it became the residence of Antoine Cruzat and his wife, Victoire Cruzat, whom you'll see later. And I'm sorry to bore you with all this genealogy, but you know, Jack Holmes and I many times had discussions about history. And one of the things that Jack always said was, and as you know, Jack was well, you may know, he was in his lifetime one of the authorities on the history of Spanish colonial Louisiana and the Spanish borderlands in North America. And he always maintained, and I always agreed with him, that genealogy is an important tool in understanding history. It's not history, but when you understand these interrelationships between people, then it helps to fill out that history tremendously. So here we see the Hyacinthe Laclotte painting of the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. Recently, I was given an 1816 lithograph by Hyacinthe Laclotte. And it was given to me by Jack McGuire, who was a councilman at large in Mandeville for many years and a banker here in New Orleans. And he wanted me to have it for Ducros, so we have it hanging in Ducros, and I actually brought it here for the Battle of New Orleans Symposium. And it's really interesting to see that lithograph because it's actually easier to see all the troop movements there. But in any event, you can see the line Jackson, which is here. And then if I recall correctly, this would be Chalmette's sugar mill. And his house, the sugar mill and Chalmette's house and most of the outbuildings all had to be destroyed because the British had placed snipers in those buildings and they were firing on the Americans. So it all had to be destroyed, and this was done prior to January 8th, 1815. You know, there were several engagements leading up to the decisive January 8th battle, beginning December 23rd, 1814, when the British actually landed and captured the Villeray plantation and used it as their headquarters. But in any event, it was a great victory, fascinating event in our history. You know, it has been said that the Battle of New Orleans enabled the United States to realize its destiny as a global power. And I firmly believe that. One must remember that by the Treaty of San Ildefonso, which was signed outside of Madrid between France and Spain, while Spain retroceded Louisiana to France, Napoleon agreed to a clause in the treaty which said that if France once again decided to alienate Louisiana, that Spain would have what we would call today right of first refusal. But of course, this was in 1802. by 1807-8, Napoleon had invited Maria Luisa and Carlos IV, the Bourbons who were reigning in Spain, to become his guests in Provence, in other words, to imprison them. And they took the bait, and then they forced their son, Fernando, to follow them into exile and into voluntary confinement. So when Napoleon turned around and sold Louisiana to the United States, many people in Europe, particularly people who were part of the reigning group of absolute monarchies, they viewed that sale as something illegal. So the American victory in the Battle of New Orleans resolved once and for all that the United States would own until today the Mississippi Valley, the city of New Orleans, and then as a result of owning the Mississippi Valley, then our way was open to expand to the Pacific coast. So without the Battle of New Orleans, or had we lost the Battle of New Orleans, I believe the outcome would have been entirely different. The British would have you believe that they were not interested in having Louisiana, and I believe now that there may be some truth to that. I think that the British were interested in having New Orleans. History repeats itself. Look at what the British did with Gibraltar. Gibraltar is a choke point, and they were able to observe and have control of commerce in the Mediterranean. Look what the British did at Hong Kong, Shanghai, different other places in the Orient. Same concept. I think that what the British were interested in most was New Orleans and controlling the commerce that they felt would evolve later in the 19th century. But again, that's just my supposition, but I firmly believe that. Philip Pittman was a captain in the British Armed Services, and he actually wrote a memorial about Louisiana, and I have a facsimile reprint of that memorial, which was published in 1770. And in that book, he has a map of the city of New Orleans. It shows where the powder magazines are. It shows where the fortifications are. It shows Fort Plaquemine in Plaquemines Parish, the earthen redoubt that became Fort Jackson. It shows Baton Rouge. And as a matter of fact, it goes all the way up the Mississippi River north of St. Louis. You can rest assured that Captain Philip Pittman was not engaged in an academic exercise. They were here to learn what Louisiana was at that point. And you've got to remember, beginning in the 1740s, the economy of France became very challenged as France pursued its objective of being a great global power, and it was one. But as a result, you can read the dispatches of Lenormand, who was the ordonnateur of Louisiana, and finally, he's authorized by the French court to solicit Spanish silver, piastre, in order to back up the money in Louisiana. And because the paper money, the livres that were being sent here, had nothing to back it up. So the British, by the 1760s, had gained significant presence in our economy. They were the merchant class here. They were selling porcelain, they were selling furniture, silver, all kinds of things. William Fitzpatrick was one of those merchants, and his letter book was published in the 1970s by LSU Press. And you can read in this book all the different French colonists who were indebted to him. So Great Britain had long been interested in New Orleans. And as I said, that's what I think would have happened. They probably would have tried to give Louisiana to Spain, but of course, after Napoleon and his interlude in Spain, there was absolutely no chance that Spain could have held on to the remainder of Louisiana. That could not have happened. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Ferdinand VII, was restored to the Spanish throne in 1814. By the time of his death, it was either 1827 or 1829, the only colonies remaining to Spain were Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippine Islands, a few islands in the Pacific, and Ceuta, and some towns and areas in northwestern Africa. That's all that remained. All the Americas had just about been lost as a result of Fernando VII and his administration. So I think that there's absolutely no chance that Spain could have held on, and then who knows if even Great Britain could have held on to New Orleans. All I will say is I do think that that was their plan. So here we see this. And then here we have the death of Ignacio de Lino, who was married to Victoria Vagin. And a terrible thing that happened to him, he actually left left New Orleans, or left Chalmette, I'm sorry, according to the Cruzat family, December 14th, the day that it was determined that the British Navy had made its presence known in the Battle of Lake Borgne. And he brought his children up to the townhouse that I told you about on Bourbon Street. And there he remained ensconced. By this time, Chalmette had become very, very obese. He loved to eat, he loved to drink, he loved to entertain, he loved to have very elaborate hunting parties. In his day, he had been, like his mother, an excellent shot. And he enjoyed all of these social activities very much. But by the early 1800s, or by the 18-teens, he was definitely deteriorating considerably. So his son went down and fought with the Louisiana militia in the Battle of New Orleans. And then he was injured. He was brought back to the house on Bourbon Street. Then Chalmette was persuaded to go and see what remained of his plantation. And according to the Cruzats, when he went down to Chalmette and he saw his house gone, everything destroyed, sugar mill destroyed, everything ruined, everything gone, everything plundered, he said nothing. He came home to Bourbon Street, and that night in March of 1815, he had a fit of apoplexy or a stroke, and he died. And he's buried in St. Louis No. 1 Cemetery. And here is the tomb. I'm ashamed to say that the last time that we did anything about the tomb was in 1976. Marigny was still alive, and she asked me to get the brick mason who had worked on the Marigny tomb to work on Chalmette's tomb. So I did, and he came up with a great price, and then Marigny wrote a letter to all the descendants and the Chabonnets and all the people who had always participated in maintaining the tomb over many, many, many years, many decades. We all gave money, a share of money, and so with that, we were able to get the tomb in good condition. But then, as you see, by the early 2000s, there was a cross, a wrought iron cross here that was stolen, and quite a bit was taken away from the tomb during that period that different people were accused of stealing things from the cemeteries. So this is the condition of the tomb more or less today, and it's something that we really do need to try to see about remedying. Here is the inventory of the succession of Ignace de Lino. Believe it or not, his total inventory, though his plantation had been destroyed, his outbuilding, sugar mill, everything had been destroyed, the inventory showed that he had assets in excess of $80,000 in 1815. However, his indebtedness was $200,000. So this created problems. This is Chalmette's half-brother, Pierre Denis Larand. Now, Pierre Denis Larand was very different than Chalmette. First of all, Chalmette never learned to speak Spanish very well, could not read it, could not write it. Denis Larand became completely fluent and had a perfect speaking, reading, and writing knowledge of Spanish. I've seen his documents in his handwriting. And he came of age in the Spanish militia, or in the Spanish army, under the tutelage of his first cousin, Pierre-Philippe de Marigny, who founded St. Bernard Parish with Galvez and with Denis Larand and others, and with, of course, primarily with the Canary Islanders, who came here and carved a settlement out of a wilderness. But in any event, Denis Larand was part of all of those things. Fascinating man. He was an accomplished military person. Unlike Chalmette, he fought at Marchac and Baton Rouge in 1779. He fought at Mobile in 1780, and he participated in the siege of Pensacola in 1781. He was the second commandant of St. Bernard Parish, and at the end of the Spanish colonial period, he was a member of the Cabildo in New Orleans. This man was very, very conservative with his money. He lived very elegantly, but he also tried to be very frugal. And so he was constantly purchasing properties, selling properties. He also, of course, had dealings with enslaved people. It was part of the economy. Doesn't make it right, but he did. He was very, very wealthy, but just as Chalmette had suffered terrible reverses during the Battle of New Orleans and lost everything, Denis Larand had not lost everything, but he also was in challenged circumstances. So he actually forced the sale of Chalmette's plantation by calling in the mortgages that he held on his half-brother's estate. So this created rather a rift for some time between the descendants of Chalmette and Denis de Larand. And since I'm related to both of them, I've always tried to look at everything equally. Bernard de Marigny, of course, quite colorfully, according to oral tradition, saw Denis Larand in front of the Bank of Louisiana in May of 1815, and he said, well, you have despoiled the widow, in French, you have despoiled the widow and the orphans, and he slapped Denis Larand over his face. But Denis Larand promptly got into the carriage and drove off because he was old enough to be Bernard's father, and he chose just to disregard it, and I'm happy he did. So what happened? The plantation was sold, and it was purchased by, I think it was Hilaire and Michel de Saint-Amand, and they were free men of color. They were descendants of the Daspy de Saint-Amand family. They were natural descendants of that family. And they became sugar planters themselves, and then they subdivided the plantation of Chalmette. And so that's how the Chalmette plantation then became called the Battleground Plantation, and ultimately was combined with the Bienvenue Plantation, which was just downriver between Chalmette and the Delarand place. But anyway, here is Denis Larand, fascinating man. He was a member of the First State Constitutional Convention in 1812. He was colonel commanding the 3rd Regiment of Louisiana Militia in the Battle of New Orleans, And when he died in 1824, he was Major General of the state militia, and he lies buried today in St. Louis No. 2 Cemetery in New Orleans. And this is what the house looked like shortly before it burned in the 1880s. And you can still see the ruin of the house in the median of St. Bernard Highway. Now, here is Madeleine Brutin Chalmette de Lino de la Ronde. And this is a wonderful portrait. It is now in the Historic New Orleans collection. And you can see what a keen mind and what a keen stare of expression she has. What a fantastic person she must have been. And I think it really comes through in that portrait. And as you saw later, she was buried in St. Louis Cathedral. This is Andrés Almonester. Denis Laronde was a member of the Cabildo. Well, his brother-in-law was Andrés Almonester y Rojas. It was Almonester y Rojas who built much of the city of New Orleans, including the Cabildo and the St. Louis Cathedral, the Casa Curial, which today we call the Presbytère, and many other important structures that benefited the quality of life in New Orleans. He was the royal standard bearer of the king in the Cabildo, and he was also, for many years, a sitting member and judge of the Cabildo. And this is a José de Salazar portrait of Almonester. And then here you see his daughter, Micaela Almonester, who married her second cousin, Celestin de Pontalba. And of course, her uncle was Chalmette. Another uncle was Denis Laronde. I think now you're seeing, after a while, all of this incest just becomes fascinating. So anyway, so there you see her as a young lady. And then, of course, there you see the lower Pontalba building, one of the two buildings that she built, flanking the Plaza de Armas, or the Place d'Armes, which is today Jackson Square, replacing a series of late 18th and very early 19th century structures which had belonged to her mother and father. And here you see the beautiful palace that the Baroness built in Paris after she resolved her problems with Tintin, with Celestin de Pontalba, and after she survived the attempt on her life by her father-in-law, who was also her cousin. She went on to undertake many different building programs or projects here in New Orleans, but also in France. And this palace, it's absolutely a palace. It was her home. She lived in it until she died. The Rothschild family purchased it from her, and then the United States government purchased it as the United States Embassy in Paris. So it's very interesting. And so you can see there was life for the Baroness after New Orleans. This is Pierre Denis Laronde, who was the Baroness's grandfather. And you can see very handsome man. And now, we've seen a half-brother of Chalmette, Pierre Denis Laronde. Now we see images of Chalmette's daughter, Victoire. This is when she married Antoine Cruzat, about 1800, and then this is right before she died in 1868. She's buried in St. Louis No. 1 in the cemetery that we still call, amongst ourselves, the Cimetière Bassin, or the cemetery at the basin, because when the cemetery was established, there was the turning basin of the old Basin Canal that Governor Carondelet had opened. But there you could see, so we don't know what Chalmette looked like. All the papers, all the portraits, all the clothing, everything in that house was destroyed by fire. And the Americans had no choice other than to destroy the house. This is Bernard de Marigny. He was Chalmette's cousin, and then after his father died in 1800, he became the ward of Chalmette. And he loved Chalmette, and Chalmette loved him, but he really had to keep quite a strong hand on Bernard. And one of the things that he told him was, a man is not whole without education. He said, I'm sending you to London, and there you will learn to speak English, and you will complete your education in English there. And so, even though they clashed a great deal, Bernard loved him very dearly, and I think of all the first cousins of his father, Pierre-Philippe de Marigny, perhaps Chalmette was the one that he was closest to, though I think the one that Pierre Marigny had the greatest respect for was Denis Larand. But in any event, very interesting story about him that I shouldn't tell, but I will tell it. And again, this is all in the realm of oral tradition. In 1864, Bernard Marigny sailed from New Orleans because in 1862, when Farragut captured the city of New Orleans in April, by the end of May, he had sworn an oath of allegiance to the United States. He was never satisfied as a Confederate. He felt that he had struggled for decades to establish his identity as a citizen of the United States, so he did what he did. This gave him some freedom to come and go. Not only was his sister, Marie-Céleste de Marigny de Livaudet, living in Paris, he also had a daughter, Agnès Mathilde de Rieux, living there, and also Michaela, who was his cousin, because Almonester had died in 1798 when Michaela was a little child. When Michaela married Célestin de Pontalba, it was Bernard de Marigny who gave her away in the wedding ceremony, and they were always very close. So, knowing that his sister Marie-Céleste was very ill, he took a ship to Paris, or to France, and then was able to go to Paris. And there he saw his sister, and of course they always bickered. There was a true sibling rivalry between the two of them. She always told him how ridiculous he was, and he always told her how frumpish she was, but still they loved each other. So then Michaela invited them to lunch in the palace that I showed you, and I call it a palace, it's just huge. So the luncheon went on for quite some time, and then after the luncheon was over, and they were drinking sherry, as a matter of fact, after the lunch, Bernard and Marie-Céleste started talking, and so did Michaela, and then Michaela discussed the problems that Marie-Céleste had with her husband, François Livaudet. And then this prompted Bernard to say, Michaela, I always wanted to know how it was on your wedding night. And so, according to what I've been told, Michaela turned and she looked at Bernard and she said, well, Bernard, the only thing I can say is this. It was an unforgettable evening, and what can I say of the situation when the groom wore more lace than the bride? So you can could draw from that whatever you wish. So anyway, Bernard was always a force to be reckoned with until his death in 1868 as well. So here we have Fazanville, and now we're going to begin to look at the legacy of Chalmette. One of those legacies is Fazanville. And you would say, well, why is that? Well, Hilaire and Michel de Saint-Amand's great-great-nephew, or great-nephew, was Jean-Pierre Fazan. And Jean-Pierre Fazan, by the way, was also a great-grandson of Catiche Villeroy, who was the natural sister of Jacques-Philippe Villeroy. His father had Jacques from his marriage with Louise de la Chaise, but he had also had a natural child, and we call it a natural child because he recognized the child as his child. So it was a natural child. She was Catiche, and she married Jean Palais. He was from Arles in Provence, and he was a bread maker. But she actually had been trained at the Couvent des Ursulines. She had a beautiful signature. She was completely illiterate. So this was one of the ancestresses of Jean-Pierre Fazan. And then, of course, the families were also connected by blood to Chalmette. But in any event, Jean-Pierre Fazan was very highly educated, very highly cultivated. As a matter of fact, some relatives of mine who were Passablancs showed me many years ago a daguerreotype, well, actually it was an ambrotype of Jean-Pierre Fazan, and he had very bright skin, chiseled features, very curly hair, and he was beautifully groomed. And you could see that he was a man of great quality, and what they told me about him was that he deplored the plight of the formerly enslaved and the free people of color after the American Civil War, and that he felt that the only way to break the cycle of plantation culture was to establish a village where these people could be educated and where they could come into their own, as it were. So that's one of the things that happened at Fazanville. There was a school there, there was a church there, and it's really fascinating. Today, architects, medical doctors, engineers, people who taught at Harvard, all came from Fazanville. So I think this is an important legacy of Chalmette's, and Chalmette always recognized that he had an extended family which was multiracial, which was not only limited to blacks, but also to indigenous Americans. So Fazanville, very interesting. And then, of course, the community of Chalmette, I think that Chalmette himself could not help but be taken with pride over the community because, you know, people who have lived in Chalmette, they all knew each other. In many respects, they were all related, many of them by marriage, sometimes by business, sometimes both ways. So that as you look at Chalmette, it actually becomes a modern manifestation of an earlier Creole society, if you will. And then, of course, knowing that Chalmette had this great love of education, I think certainly the high school would be something that he would be so very proud of and would really want to support. So, you see, it's over. Isn't that nice? Do any of you have any questions? Yes, Kristen.
You said that he left in December.
Mm-hmm.
Did they make any, I mean, they didn't know that his plantation was going to become a battleground. When Jackson fell back to the Rodriguez Canal on Christmas Eve, did he make any attempt whatsoever?
It was impossible for him to go down there. And, you know, his health was such, remember, Le Gros, the fat one, how was he going to go down there? And then by this time, his enslaved labor had been taken prisoner and taken away. He was very limited in what he could do. And no one, you know, the only people left in New Orleans were the elderly or the infirm. And of course, unfortunately, he would qualify as an infirm person, and for that day and time, too, the elderly. So there was no way that he could go down there. And remember, he had a house completely furnished, very elegantly appointed on Bourbon Street. So what was he going to do with a two-story house full of things? You know, it would have been an impossibility. And who was to know, you know, Chalmette was the eternal optimist. And he always had great good luck. But as we know, everyone's luck runs out. And unfortunately, when the British invaded Louisiana, that's when Chalmette's luck ran out. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned the Crozat family.
Cruzat.
It occurs to me that in the
No, 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 no. Skip, I'm so happy that Marie is not alive to hear you say that. I made that mistake as a little boy, 6 years old. And she looked at me and she said, "We are not Crozat, we are Cruzat, C-R-U-Z-A-T. And the first one in that family to come here was Francisco Javier Cruzat. And they claimed to be relatives of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And they were Spanish Basques in origin. And they actually came here with Alejandro O'Reilly, otherwise known as Alexander O'Reilly, the second governor of Louisiana. And then Francisco, very interesting man. He was about 5'10". He had light olive skin, dark eyes, dark hair. There were images that Marie had of him. And then as a little boy, I was allowed to handle his sword cane. He had been governor of Upper Louisiana in St. Louis, and he judged St. Louis such a crime-ridden and dangerous place that wherever he went in St. Louis, he carried the sword cane. So when Marie died, she had a niece who had children, and now the children in Houston have the cane. So that's Cruzat, not Crozat. Now, there were Crozats who married into the Ducrot family who were also related to me. And then, Georges Crozat had Homer's house, and then, oh Lord, his sister, I can't think of her name now, Anita, she had Bocage. And it was always interesting to see the dynamics between Marie Cruzat and Georges and Anita Crozat. But anyway, go on, I'm sorry. Skip, it's really, at this point, Marie's been dead since 1980, and I think probably I'm the only one that would really even know about it anymore. It's one of those wonderfully arcane Louisiana things that we just have to kind of chuckle about these days. But anyway, the Cruzat's a very interesting person. Yes, you have a question. Yes. All right, the Caserta House, this is what happened. Wayne Cressup was a sitting judge in St. Bernard Parish, and he purchased the Caserta farm, including the farmhouse, which was inviolate, and it was, for those of you who know Poydras, it was directly across the street from Nicosia Supermarket. It was near Farmside Road. And the Casertas worked it as a farm for decades. They bought it about 1910. Gaetano Caserta and his wife purchased the property, and it was part of the old Reunion plantation, which had belonged to the Ducrot family. Judge Cressup gave us the house, so he asked that his name be appended to it because he had purchased the property and then he gave us the house. So that's why we call it the Caserta Cressup House. But of course, we have photographs of the Casertas there. Judge Cressup never lived in it, and we always talk about the Casertas. And people are interested in the Casertas as a family of Sicilian farmers who came to St. Bernard in the early 20th century. Well, now you know. That and $5, and you can have a cup of coffee at Starbucks. Are there any other questions? Well, I want to thank all of you for putting up with my rambling tonight, and I hope you didn't find it too boring. I think it's really fascinating that we have all of these families that connect to Quebec, to Saint-Domingue, to Spain, to that part of Spain known as the Canary Islands, to Sicily, which was part of the Spanish Empire for several centuries. It's just fascinating when you look at all the global connections of Louisiana. And then when you think about the role of the Battle of New Orleans and the Chalmette's plantation in determining the destiny of the United States. Thank you so much.